She needs it. Thank you, Deirdre. Oh no, hurry, sit. That means she's right.
Okay, so welcome members. I presume we are live now.
We should be live now, Chair.
Welcome members and everyone else to the 82nd meeting of the Committee for Finance in the 22 to 27 mandate. As always, members, we will be broadcast online and throughout Parliament buildings. Usual rules apply in relation to your phones. It's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting, but it will be broadcast, as I said. We have one apology. Agenda item 1 is apologies. We have one apology. Dr. Aiken is with the Windsor Framework Committee, I believe, in London, and Jerry Carroll is attending remotely. Everyone else is with us. Agenda item 2 is the declaration of interests. Members are obliged to declare any relevant interest. Does anyone have an interest they wish to declare? No? Okay. Agenda item 3 is chairperson's business, and one item from purely because we will not be meeting as a committee until after the next consideration. So I just want to place on the record that I've submitted amendments for debate to the Fiscal Council Bill, some of which were discussed, or versions of them previously, and I'm happy to talk to members or indeed their colleagues about those. They're hopefully relatively interesting and not controversial, but just wanted to put that on the record. So that's chairperson's business. Agenda item 4. So we will be in the Fiscal Council Bill Tuesday, I think, at consideration stage.
Tuesday, yes, Chair.
Yes. So I need to get some speech notes ready, hopefully. So agenda item 4 is draft minutes of the meeting we held on the 22nd of April. They're page 7 of your meeting pack. So members, people content with those minutes? Are there any changes? If not, I'll sign them. Agenda item 5 is matters arising. So we're going through Dallow extract. That begins at page 18. The first of which relates to transformation funding. And at page 19 of the pack, we have had a response from the department. You will know that we asked the department for a breakdown of the 132 of the 130 million pounds of commitments, and how much has been deployed thus far. We have that, remember, that starts at page 19 of the pack, and it is consistent with some of what has been, I think, reported. So that is in the it's at page 19 of your pack, and as you'll see, it runs down the multidisciplinary team, especially the SEN transformation, speeding up justice, and a few others, and highlights something that's been reported already, which is that in year 1, thus far, in terms of dispersal transformation fund monies, basically £129,000 has been spent, just well, and then once you add on admin costs, just over 130,000, which, if my very basic calculations are correct, would indicate that we're basically have spent near zero of the statistically a very small amount of what has been spent. I think we should ask if the department aren't already giving it to us for a breakdown of the profile.
We do have a request in, Chair. It's when this answer came back, it didn't include that. So the court request is in. It went in as a separate request because we'd asked over 2 different meetings. So that request will also have a due date, but we will see if we can have that one hurried up as well, because obviously, as you say, we've had those high-level figures before, but we've not had how much has been drawn down as yet.
Yeah, and we do know that's sorry, that's the bit which has been covered. We haven't got the detail on how much has been drawn down, but also not just how much has been drawn down, what the planned profile was, so that we can compare what's been drawn down with what was expected. And I think this is important information, and we will have an oral briefing whenever we find that out. Deputy Chair.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that that it would be good to have that profile of the spending and the planned anticipation of what would be spent in each year, and basically whether everything is on track, because much is made in the press of the amount that has been drawn down to date, whereas in a lot of those projects I would expect that was largely on track, because the first year when you stand up a new transformation programme, you're probably not going to spend a huge amount of the money. So yeah, I just support you in that.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, and it may well be the case. I think it's just important for us to see whether that is the case, and if there's any issue with how the money's been profiled, and much less, or indeed much more, though that seems unlikely, of the money has been drawn down. It would be helpful to understand why. So we would urge the department to get us that as quickly as possible. 5.3 is relates to the renewables obligation scheme. We previously asked the department for a breakdown for further updates from the department, but the comparable NI scheme. The department has indicated that the Treasury has confirmed that funding is available, that it cannot be used for other purposes, and that legislation related to this is being progressed by the Department for Energy and Net Zero. So if anybody wishes to come in on that, I would simply say we'll just be kept abreast of that. I know it'll be primarily Economy Department and therefore committee that will be looking at it, but it would be helpful if we could be kept abreast of it too. So the next item relates to follow-up information from the NICS People Strategy Fall, and this is page 21. Following the recent oral briefing with departmental officials on the NICS People Strategy, the committee requested additional information. The People Strategy Highlight Report for October 25 to January 26 has been provided, along with the most recent NICS Board Dashboard. Sorry, that's a bit of a mouthful, which is sent to the board every 6 months. The next one, I presume that's the next board meeting or the next board the update, is at the end of May. The department has highlighted that the most recent quarterly sickness absence publication covered, October 24 to December 24, was published. This was published in February 25 and copied to this committee. However, publication of these official statistics has been suspended due to, quote, resource constraints. However, departments still have access to sickness absence management information. The next planned NISRA publication on this topic will be the annual sickness absence report, which is scheduled to be published before summer of 2026. So first of all, members, if we're agreed that we'll be copied into all NICS board dashboards from going forward, I think it's helpful, particularly in the context of our inquiry, and that we add the information to the evidence base for the inquiry. Secondly, in relation to the finding out that the quarterly sickness statistics are basically suspended, but that there still is sickness absence data being gathered, but it's not being gathered as frequently, am I understanding that correctly, as it was previously?
It's a live process, Chair. It's inputted into a system. What this is basically saying is it's not being extrapolated as a collective report, if I can put it that way. Yeah. New systems will allow that to be done without any manual process. However, as members will be aware, we've consistently been having these. The committee has always had these throughout its iterations. So this is a new issue, and it might be worth exploring with the department how the resource has moved elsewhere or is no longer available or whatever.
It would be helpful to understand, particularly in the context of the NICS inquiry, and also the fact that this is obviously one of the main things we wanted to establish information about. It's just not ideal from our perspective as a committee that one of the main issues we have been investigating as part of this inquiry, the data is now not going to be collected in the same way anymore, so will have less information. Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, and I would agree with what you said. We've raised this consistently. The cost of sick leave to the Northern Ireland Civil Service is in the region of £45 million every single year. It's a huge cost, and it's really concerning that the Department of Finance would deprioritise allocating staff to keep the quarterly reports coming, because those reports are the accountability mechanism, the governance, what goes back into place to try to set targets to manage this, just to keep shining a light on it, and to see this not being reported on for over a year in this way is really concerning, because just having the annual report, which likely will show another significant increase, as has been the pattern, isn't really good enough. We need the quarterly reports to be trying to see what the movement is every quarter of the year. So I think that it would be important to write into the department, to the HR function, to understand where these resources have been prioritised to, and why this isn't a high priority.
Can I just understand, is it the department or NISRA where the resource issue is?
Yeah, there's a question.
Well, we can ask the head of NISRA. who's involved in this
Well,
very
he
soon.
will be. No, my understanding would be well, actually, no. I think it probably would be good for him to clarify exactly how that's
Okay,
put together.
I'm going to make sure we can ask him that in a few minutes.
Obviously, they wouldn't own the system. They pretty much do most of the extrapolation of stats, so that would be useful to get a bit of an understanding from him.
Okay. Anyone, other members are content with that? We'll now go on to readouts following the meeting on the 15th of April. Right, which start at page 62, but then we are at page 64 for a readout response on the Criminal Justice Sentencing Bill. The committee previously asked the Department, i.e. the Department of Finance, whether it has any remit on the Criminal Justice Sentencing Bill. The Department has said no, it's a nil return, so are members content that we give a nil return to the Justice Committee? Yes. 5.7 is the Communities Committee, Children's Services Cooperation Act, that's at page 65 of the meeting pack. The Communities Committee has again written to the Minister of Finance requesting a copy of updated guidance on the Children's Services Cooperation Act. This committee has been copied into the correspondence as a courtesy. That's to note, if members are content to note. 5.8 is the Committee for Justice, Jade's Law, Policy Work Update. That's at page 71 of the pack. Following consideration of correspondence from an individual in relation to the tragic death, obviously people will be aware of murder, I think we should say, of Amy Doherty in Derry. The Justice Committee agreed to write to both the Justice Department and Finance Department asking if any policy development work has been undertaken in this area. We have been copied into correspondence as a courtesy. Members will recall that at last week's meeting the committee agreed a similar course of action, asking the Department of Finance for an update following a meeting between the Finance Minister and officials which was taking place last week. Correspondence from the Minister was received late last night and is included at page 5 of the tabled pack. The Minister indicates that he has asked his officials to undertake detailed policy development that is required across a range of parental responsibility, family law matters, with a view to developing legislation that will be ready in the early part of the next mandate. The issue is considered cross-cutting, therefore the Minister will be corresponding shortly with the Justice Minister to obtain agreement to proceed with the work. Officials will be available to brief the committee as proposals are framed for the Minister's consideration over the coming month. We'll go to the Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I just want to say I really welcome this correspondence coming through from the Minister to confirm that work will progress on this. Following the murder of Amy Doherty, this has really launched this campaign here in Northern Ireland. My colleague Julie Middleton, MLA up in Foyle, had met with the campaigners and up on that just a couple of weeks ago and has pushed it forward. But with the Programme for Government Priority Event and Violence Against Women and Girls very much centred around addressing these issues, the huge problem we have of femicide here, it really is a priority. So as I say, I welcome the progression of this. I totally understand the elections next year and we wouldn't be expecting to see something rush through this mandate, but I just think it's really encouraging to see this strong commitment to work on the policy work in this really, really important area. And if there's anything that this committee can do to work to progress this, to consult, do anything in support of it, I would just propose that we would offer that to the Minister, because I think that it's a really important piece of work, and I would think, but I don't speak on behalf of everyone, that the entire committee would probably be off the same view, and it's good to see some progress.
Indeed, yes, I very much agree with that. Jim O'Donnell.
Yeah, just to echo the Deputy Chair's words as well, I want to praise the Minister for acting so quick on this, and it is very welcome. Unfortunately, it is needed, but yeah, just as the Deputy Chair said, if there's anything we can do to help, we're more than willing.
Well, I would say just from the committee's perspective, once we know from the Minister and the Department further details, we should look to do an oral evidence briefing, I would say, and also anything we can as it was, we'll get advice from the clerks about what would be most useful for an incoming committee or assembly next year, who will be examining legislation, should that be the decision that's made. So any scrutiny we can do in advance, I think, is probably the most practical contribution we can make whenever we know what the policy direction is. Okay, so 5.9 is the Treasury response to the NI Affairs Committee on energy bill support. So members, that's at page 75 of the meeting pack. And there...
Sorry, Chair, can we just agree?
Oh, I need to
copy
agree, which
that
I
to the
didn't agree
Justice
that.
Committee, yeah.
Clearly asked me to, I didn't.
They haven't seen that.
Members are content. We'll copy that correspondence to the Justice Committee for their information. So then, at page 75, we have a letter from the Treasury, from a Treasury Minister, Lord Livermore, to the Chair of the NI Affairs Committee. The NI Affairs Committee asked Treasury about support for energy bills in Northern Ireland. The Financial Secretary of the Treasury has confirmed that Amy cover will only be provided for a comparable offer to funding 75% of the domestic share of the renewables obligation via the Exchequer between 26-27 and 28-29, the scheme that is being delivered in Britain. The UK Government will continue to work with the Executive on this scheme, including on a business case for Treasury approval. It's also highlighted that Treasury has not applied the Barnett formula, but has instead based proportionate funding on the level of heating oil use across the nations, resulting in devolved governments receiving almost half of the funding announced. Treasury continues to monitor the situation, and as the Chancellor has set out, any further support will be targeted to those who need it most, or that's what they say in their correspondence. Now, I think we would be well asking, given the claim is made in this letter from the Treasury, that the Treasury is monitoring the situation in relation to those who need it most. I think an outstanding question for us is it properly aware and abreast of quite the level of need, including the reliance on home heating oil, given the political instability at the minute, and obviously there's a deeply unstable situation. There's an unstable person in the White House. There's an unstable situation in the Middle East. I would suggest, members, that we copy this letter to the department, and who might want to copy it on further on to the Executive, to highlight this point that is made, that further support will be basically so that they're aware. So if members are content, we'll copy this to the department.
Great.
We're content, yeah. And to see if that what that claim means in practice. Okay, 5.10 is from the Lord Scrutiny Committee. That's at page 70 of the meeting pack. There's a reply from the NI Scrutiny Committee regarding their work. They will continue to update us on the issue of duty relief for small parcels. So that's to note. 5.11 is again from the NI Affairs Scrutiny Committee. And it's a simplified tariff treatment for the distance sales of goods and elimination of the customs duty threshold. That's page 80 of the meeting pack, where there's correspondence from the House of Lords NI Scrutiny Committee to the Financial Secretary seeking further information on the issue previously discussed. We've been copied in, and we'll get the reply in due course if members are content. Now, 5.12 is the disposal of Fermanagh House. All the details are at page 3 of the tabled pack. So we've discussed this and other property disposals. It probably should be said that the disparity between the valuation and the final sale price is less than it was in other instances, which is, I suppose, reassuring or less kind of concerning than in other transactions that we've talked about in committee. The original valuation for Fermanagh House, which is, I think I'm right in saying, just on Ormo Avenue opposite the BBC, I think that's where it is, isn't it? Was
the back.
Yeah, it was £1.5 million was the original valuation, and it was sold. The sale completed on the 2nd of April this year for £1.4 million. So that's the Deputy Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I had asked previously, I'm not sure if we've got anything through, in terms of we've got the Civil Service Office estate policy and they're moving forward and they've decided what they're going to dispose of, but how that interacts with the ongoing can't think SAMU, the asset unit. We were down at LPS and we saw that, mapped across Northern Ireland, and are they interfacing? Is someone stopping to say this is our estate? Does any other department actually want any use of it? So just are the two things actually speaking to each other in terms of the strategic asset review as to this is everything that government owns in Northern Ireland, and or is the office estate just saying we don't need this anymore, so we're going to dispose of it because if there's other use elsewhere within the public sector, be it for housing or whatever it may be. I know that was kind of the objective, and we had went through that when we were out at LPS, so it would be good to know, are the two things actually speaking to each other, as one being decided in isolation to the other?
Yes, I think we've asked a similar question before and we've got not an entirely clear answer, but we can ask it again. Okay. Members are content with that. Agenda item 6 is the SL1 baby loss certificate regulations Northern Ireland 2026. The SL1 is in today's pack. It was subject to the new process that was introduced in January this year. The proposed statutory rule is to provide the means to enable the provision of a baby loss certificate to those who have lost a baby prior to the end of the 24th week of pregnancy. Members, please note that the SL1 draft SR and explanatory memorandum have been published in line with new delegated legislation processes. A call for views ran from the 16th to the 29th of April, which is yet today, so it's still ongoing until midnight tonight. One response was received and comments have been reflected in the scrutiny paper at this pack. Papers begin at page 6 of the tabled pack, where you will see a scrutiny paper on the baby loss certificate regs, an SL1 letter from the Department at page 11 of the tabled pack, a draft statutory rule at page 15, explanatory memorandum at page 19, further correspondence from the Department at page 21, including from page 25, which is particularly interesting for the committee, I think, given some of the questions we've asked. From page 25, template certificates, which are offered in English only, Irish only, and bilingual formats. So the committee considered this at the meeting on the 15th of April. Members agreed to ask officials to come to today's meeting in order to ask some questions about the scheme. So members, just to make clear, it's page 25 of the tabled pack is where you will see the template certificates.
Chair, just to clarify for members, when we do our citizen space, it closes at midnight the day before. So it's like 1 minute past midnight. So it's the 29th, but it's kind of the 1 minute past midnight thing. So ours closed and it's complete.
Okay.
No responses.
We have Philip Wales, who's the Registrar General and Chief Executive of NISRA, and Aoife Rooney, who's the Deputy Registrar of NISRA. Just to say in advance, Philip, there are 1 or 2 other matters which we may just ask you about while you're here. As often as you know, we're opportunistic, but a couple of things, including the statistics which came out yesterday, and a matter which has come up in our in some of our other discussions here. So we might just cover those off after we've done the SL1 and the certificates. But thank you for coming. And if you want to provide us an opening statement, that would be most helpful. Members, as always, indicate if you want to ask a question.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Chair. It's great to be able to be with you and to be able to brief you on this matter today. As the committee is aware, the regulations that are in front of you set out the legal framework for the issue of baby loss certificates here in Northern Ireland. They include provisions about what the baby loss certificates will contain. That's Regulation 4. The form of the application required prior to issuing a certificate, Regulation 5. How GRO will maintain records of these certificates, Regulation 6. And then Regulation 7, how a change might be made to an existing certificate. The regulations themselves are, of course, just one component of the work that GRO has been doing to prepare for the issue and go live of this scheme. That wider work programme includes things like the IT systems, developing the IT functionality that's needed to enable citizens to apply online for these certificates. Developing a business process, making sure that we've got sufficient staff in place to be able to meet the expected demand for these certificates, setting up the infrastructure in the office and preparing communications for stakeholders. So there's a lot of work that's been going on. And actually progress towards all of those objectives has been good over the last several months. The work that we've been doing, particularly on the IT system, has progressed well and remains on track for completion in the coming weeks, subject to any changes that might happen through the legislative process. We've had new staff join in GRO. They're being trained up in the certificate production systems. The required office infrastructure is now in place as well, and communications and guidance for stakeholders are also being prepared. Subject to your views and those of the Assembly, it's our assessment that we'll be able to bring this scheme into operation during June, so long as things proceed smoothly. Chair, if it's okay, I'd like to address the specific issue that was raised a couple of weeks ago too, if that's okay, which has to do with the layouts and the structure of the certificates. In particular, I know the committee were asking about whether the fields provided for under Regulation 5 would always appear on the certificate, and so when someone didn't provide information, they would be blank, or whether boxes on the certificate would disappear if somebody didn't provide information. Let me just begin, I suppose, by saying I really understand why that question is being asked and the strength of feeling behind it. It's obviously been our intention from the outset to develop this scheme in a way that's compassionate and that meets as many needs as possible, that we're trying to help people rather than hurt or upset them. We sought to shape the scheme as far as possible around the consultation evidence that's been provided to us. The committee's aware we had 1,182 responses to our consultation. That gives us a good basis on which to go. But I hope you'll also recognise that it is not always possible to meet everybody's desires and needs all of the time. And when you have different views about how to proceed with something, you need to make a decision about how to proceed. On the layout, as we've put into the briefing for committee ahead of time, we've said that it's our intention that the certificates will include boxes for most, if not all, of the fields allowed for in Regulation 5. The effect of that is in the templates that are in front of you. Where someone does not have or chooses not to provide information, those fields will be left blank. If I just say a little bit about the reasoning for that decision, because it is in layers. I think firstly, if you step back from the individual responses and the detail of the report, one of the overwhelming pieces of feedback is that people want these losses to be recognised on an equal footing with births, with deaths, with stillbirths, and that they should follow as far as possible the pattern of the certificates that are issued for those other events, so that we can recognise losses early in pregnancy on a similar basis to those life events. Those other certificates that are issued, births, deaths, stillbirths, they don't get modified in any way. They're not customisable. Fields don't drop in and out of them. And in lots of very sad circumstances, information sometimes isn't available for all of those life events. So it does happen that we have blank boxes on official life events certificates. Secondly, the committee will be able to see from the consultation report that the question of layout did split respondents. A sizable minority of respondents said that they didn't want to have unavailable fields on the certificate, but half of all respondents said they wanted to include empty boxes if information wasn't provided, even if those boxes might appear blank. So recognising that there is a split of opinion, half of all people said that they would support the inclusion of all fields, and it was very clear in the consultation document that we were saying that. Thirdly, I think although we came into this process with an open mind and very much thought that this might be where we ended up, actually we became concerned through the course of this process that certificates with very few boxes completed could, for example, just have the date of issue, the issue number, the name perhaps of the mother, that a certificate that just had 3 of those fields would lose some of its cohesion as a certificate. It would lose some of its integrity. It would be a very large page with a relatively small number of boxes at the top. Practical considerations have also played a role here. Customizable baby loss certificates are outside of the capacity of our existing IT systems, and we've used those to bring this scheme forward quickly to meet as many needs as we can. Those IT systems are built to provide consistent life event certificates that are all arranged in a particular way. Developing that functionality to change the arrangements or the layout would involve new systems to do something that's very similar to something we already do, duplicating some of our existing systems with limited reusability. And from my point of view, as someone who wants to make this the best job possible, certificates would likely take longer and need to be subject to greater checks. So if you allowed customizable certificates and the same 3 boxes were filled in for 2 different applications, you'd want those boxes probably to be in the same order, in the same layout. There isn't tech, at least not at the moment, in GRO to enable you to make sure that they would look the same for 2 individual people, perhaps the same person applying in 2 different occasions. So there's a real need for quality to be built into the process there. I suppose finally it's also worth noting that the templates that we put in front of you are very similar to the schemes that are in operation in England and in Scotland. We also have different needs here, and we've tried to meet those, but just note on the way past that they're very similar, and blank fields may appear in those certificates. I suppose I'd just conclude by saying, we are continuing to engage with stakeholders in respect of the detail of what will go on the certificate and the contents. There were sessions with stakeholders yesterday. There are more sessions tomorrow. We're here to take your feedback here today also. We'll take that away. Changes, of course, are a matter for ministers rather than officials. But with that, by way of a short summary both of where we are today and the issue particularly at hand, I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. As always, members do indicate, should you wish to ask a question, just a couple of, specific points about the certificates. There's a couple of respondents, because of the way the regulation does not set out geographic specificity. So just talk us through in an instance where perhaps the person has suffered baby loss in, for example, in hospital in Donegal or Dublin, or I guess for that matter across the water. They obviously will have a choice as to whether that geographic location box is filled in, but can they put in, I don't know, just for the sake of argument, Letterkenny Hospital, or is that the regulations allow for that, or is there an issue there?
We've thought long and hard about eligibility for the certificates. We have said, and the conclusion of the discussions here is that in order to be eligible to apply for this scheme, an applicant needs to be resident in Northern Ireland, or the loss needs to have occurred in Northern Ireland, or the applicant, because we're doing historical losses also, they need to have been resident in Northern Ireland at the time of the loss. Okay. So they might be resident somewhere else today, but were resident here at the time of the loss. And that is, if I just finish it, I think that is about as generous as we are permitted to be under law, because the Assembly is not permitted to legislate for events or for people who reside outside of Northern Ireland.
So I'm understanding it. There, a person or a couple who seek a baby loss certificate who the loss has happened. I could just give the example of someone who's just on another part of the island, not in the north. They are eligible as they are resident in Northern Ireland, and that would also be the case if it was in Scotland or any other part of the world, or does that would have to be in the UK or Ireland?
Yes, that's right. So as long as they are resident here, they're eligible for a baby loss certificate.
Your information as to where the incident occurred or the loss occurred would be is where the information they give.
Eligibility is established by where they're resident in that instance, so they would be able to apply and specify that it happened in Donegal or in Dublin or in Edinburgh, and that they would be eligible under those terms.
Does the place of loss, should they choose to include the place of loss, it doesn't matter if it's not in Northern Ireland then?
We would issue a certificate to someone who was resident in Northern Ireland, irrespective of where the loss had taken place.
That's really helpful. Thank you for clarifying that.
I should say that is different to how it is in England.
That's more generous, is it, than it is in England? Or more not generous is putting it in the wrong way, forgive me. It's more flexible.
We have a wider eligibility than the English scheme. So in order to be eligible in England, it's my understanding that you need to be resident and have a GP, have a health service number in England. We were mindful that people who are resident here might, as you say, travel and then suffer a loss and find themselves ineligible in England, ineligible here, and wanted to avoid those circumstances. I would also just mention we have had some initial conversations with GRO Ireland to share the benefits of the experience that we've had here. There isn't a scheme that's happening in the Republic at the moment, but we have talked to them about it.
There is another respondent asked, so we're kind of since asking on their behalf about eligibility in relation to families who are using surrogacy, and whether the intended parents, I suppose is the correct phrase, would be who are experiencing a loss, but obviously it's different from biological parents. Is that are they covered by the regulations, and can they apply for a baby loss certificate?
Yes, they are, both the surrogate and the parents who in your question are applying.
Or the intended parents. Okay, that's most helpful. And I suppose just finally for me, before I bring in colleagues and again indicate members should you wish to come in, your expectation is once this passes, this will be available from June effectively, so people who have experienced baby loss will then from June this year will be able to apply and receive these?
Yes, I think we're not taking anything about the assembly process for granted here, Chair, but we are making plans and preparations. The IT system is probably the single biggest outstanding thing other than the legislation, and we're working on that. Those projects are, of course, sometimes challenging, but so far it looks promising.
Have you made an estimate of the volume of take up and how much resource you'll need to devote to it?
So it's very difficult to do this with any degree of accuracy. The number of losses of this nature is unknown.
Yes.
There are estimates, but it's very difficult. The best thing that we've been able to do is to look at the schemes that are in operation already. So we've looked in particular at the English scheme. We've liaised through the Department of Health here with the managers of the English scheme. They had 105,000 applications in the first 16 or 17 months of their operation. That covers both the period when it was open only back to 2018 and then prior to that. I think if you work that out as a share of a population share, that leaves us estimating between 3,000 and 4,000 applications in year number one as a whole. We've also had some dealings with the Scottish scheme. I think that was a little less high profile and implies a slightly lower number. But to our mind, both of those numbers feel maybe a little bit on the low side. I think we had 1,182 respondents to our consultation. We know there are therefore at least that many motivated parents or would-be parents out there. We think the 3,000 to 4,000 applications, if that is a low estimate, we're making provision to be able to supply something in the order of 5,000 certificates in year one. Okay. We're also developing this system on top of our existing IT, which may seem a point to the side, but actually that means it's very easy for us to move people flexibly from other certificates over to baby loss certificates if it turns out that our demand is wildly in excess of that. We also will not put a delivery timescale on baby loss certificates to begin with. I think the English scheme experience suggests there'll be a very big peak of demand in those first few weeks, and that feels like a real hostage to fortune. When things settle down, we'll move to the usual 5 working day assumption that we make, an objective that we make for all of our life event certificates. But at least to begin with, we'll give ourselves a little bit of flexibility and beg patience from those who have applied. Okay,
and I think that's reasonable in the circumstances. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this. I remember back to whenever we first discussed this here in committee, and it's great to see it so close to being rolled out. So thank you, and thank you for all of your work on that to get this far. I just wanted to ask a couple of things, and it was myself that had asked about the empty boxes and things. I wonder, it doesn't really say it in the regulations. I know the language says may include all of the following, so name and sex and all of the rest of it. I'm just trying to get it up here. But even though it says may to the users of it, to make it that little bit more compassionate and user friendly, maybe would you think it should go a little bit further and say if you so wish, or something a little bit more? You don't always have, especially for early loss. There's not even a potential to find out. So it just, it just says you may include all of the following on it, but something to that effect is in. So I don't really know exactly the answer, but this is kind of where I'm coming from. So whenever, you look at the, the actual certificate, and that's going to be empty. It doesn't really say anything on the certificate. So I was looking back to the regulations to see if there was something. I don't know if there's something that could be built in around that, just to.
We can certainly look at the guidance that will appear on the portal online when people are applying.
Don't feel like, you know,
that they have
you're
to make
obliged or it's any to the difference or something, but it just I'm just very mindful of that, and just making people feel that you know, one certificate or one baby is more valuable than another, especially as some people may have multiple certificates as they're coming through. The other thing I was just going to ask, in terms of, I wish I had a birth certificate sitting in front of me right now so I could think of this, but whenever I'm looking at the certificate, it looks that bit vague. So, you know, in terms of, you know, tracing records over time, should it have a place for like the address or of the parents or something to tie it back? Because if I'm not mistaken, you know, on like birth certificates and things, you know, it's tied to like an address of a parent or something. So even like for myself, like a BT34 or something, if somebody many years into the future looks back at records of, you know, like tracing their family tree over the years, is there any way to actually tie that to an address or a family clan townland or anything like that?
So we will be seeking from applicants their address to be able to send them the certificate. The address, I don't think the address was one of the fields that we proposed for inclusion in the certificate, and it wasn't one of the ones that people told us. I understand why you're asking the question, but it wasn't one of the ones that the consultation told us. I think we've also been quite, I suppose we've been quite careful about what we've said about records management here, which is the slightly formal term for, I think, what you're describing. We're putting the baby loss certificate registrations on the same footing as the stillbirth register, which is to say these are closed records, and so they wouldn't be searchable by relatives subsequently. I think, again, we asked in the consultation, because again, this was something that split opinion. Do you want us to retain this information for a short period of time, for a longer period of time, or indefinitely for record searching, as you've described? And we got everyone telling us quite different things. The majority, though, indicated they were most comfortable with us keeping the information just for a period to enable a certificate to be issued and then for amendments to be made, so quite a short period of time. So in this instance, this, if you like, is a certificate that would go to a family, and I hope would stay with a family as part of their, maybe as their records.
I suppose that's the way to carry the legacy and the family tree on internally, and no, I fully appreciate that. I was just, as I was thinking myself, you know, how it will come through in generations to come, would you look back and learn a little bit more about members of your family. But no, that's all I have, but just want to thank you again. It's really good to see this progressing, and thanks for being here today. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Gemma Dolan.
Thank you, and thank you again. And as the Deputy Chair has said, you know, it's welcome that you are here and that it's come to this stage. I just have one question, and I think it's probably stupid, but so do people have to give proof of address at the, you know, for people, say people who are now living in the south but were living in the north when they lost the baby, do they have to give proof, or how do you know that
they don't have to give? So they will declare their address, and we'll take everything that they tell us at face value. So we won't be attempting in any way to verify that a loss has taken place, or linking in with medical records, or checking addresses. We'll take what they tell us at face value. Again, that does differ a little bit from the other schemes that are in operation, but that's the way that we've set this one up to work.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Brian Kingston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Philip and Aoife. In terms of the issue of whether fields should be included or not, I mean, I understand what you're saying from the consultation about, well, the need for consistency, and I suppose if a field is blank, it doesn't leave a question mark as such over whether this information hasn't been included, and people wanting to see something which is comparable to other certificates, you know, so, but clearly you've said there was a strong difference of opinion, you know, but there was more supported having standard fields in the consultation.
That's right. We obviously set out to meet as many people's needs as possible, but sometimes when there's a sort of a conflict in views, it's difficult to, as you'll be familiar with, meet everyone's needs all of the time, and that's the determination that we made on this specific point, recognising that won't meet everybody's needs or preferences.
And these certificates are only issued when requested, and in terms of the field there for date of delivery, so would that only apply in a stillbirth situation? Is that right? Or
So I'm glad you asked that question. I think this is one specific point that we're continuing to go back with our stakeholders to make sure that we have interpreted correctly the feedback that we've received. The date of loss and the date of delivery can be different dates. They can be the same dates. Circumstances where someone finds out that they've suffered a loss on one day, and then the delivery follows on a different day can occur. Some people have told us they want the date of loss. Some people have told us they want the date of delivery. Some people have told us they want both. And we want, as I say, to make sure that we are being compassionate. This is obviously very, very personal set of data and fields. So we are going back and forth with stakeholders here to make sure that we've got this correct. For the time being, the box carries both labels and both pieces of information. One or either or neither can be provided.
Right. Okay. And in terms of what's currently recorded at registration of birth, deaths and marriages and councils and so on, just from my own understanding, is a stillbirth recorded officially currently? Then how is that recorded currently?
So stillbirths are recorded in much the same way that deaths and births are. You're issued with a certificate of a standard form, and
stillbirth, a certificate is issued.
It is issued. That's correct. So stillbirth, is what's registered after 24 weeks of pregnancy has passed.
Yes, after 24 weeks. Yeah.
So the baby loss certificate scheme fills the gap prior to 24 weeks where there is no official recognition.
Okay. And on the samples that you've provided, there's 3 samples. One is the headings are in English and Irish. One's Irish only, one's English only. So I mean, and whether or not these count as official certificates, but in terms of headings, I'd have always assumed that English is the working language of the country, so English should be included in headings. The answers in these are in English. So I don't know, this is maybe at an early stage, but are these official samples, or has that decision been made?
So they are our existing samples. As I say, there is still a bit of back and forth with stakeholders around that one specific field to do with the dates and how we will record that. But these otherwise are very late stage. They won't appear in this very attractive grayscale. This is just because they'll appear on the official certificate paper that doesn't scan very nicely or print very nicely. So they will look a little better, I hope, than what we have here. In terms of the language, life events certificates provided by GRO presently, births, deaths, marriages, and so on, are available with English headings, with Irish headings, or with bilingual headings. That follows an NDNA commitment to make life events registerable in Irish, and so we have followed the practice that we have elsewhere. The ambition is broader, I think, to be able to use Irish more in the registration service. We haven't been able to take that further than we have than just headings at this stage. For the rest of our life events certificates, but as this is a new development, we've been able to take that a little bit further and make them available in Irish. I'm aware that language is a contested space and that it's a difficult issue, but for the time being, we have stayed true to, as far as possible, the ambitions of the NDNA and the direction for registration more broadly, consistent with the ambition that we should have consistency between baby loss certificates, birth and death certificates, and so on.
that is how birth certificates and death certificates can be, the individual can choose to have them.
Yes.
The headings as they wish. Right?
Yes, in English or in Irish or in dual language.
Okay, thank you.
It's worth saying these are certificates, obviously, that will be profoundly personal to people and not for, so it's understandable that people are allowed to have them in these ways, in whatever language they wish. Dearly Hargy.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And I like the layout because I get you're trying to be as inclusive as you can, obviously, on this sensitive issue, but you want to try and keep a conformity because, again, that's what many of the families are asking for. And I think it's the right approach in terms of where they choose. I think it's maybe how it's put across that you don't have to fill in all the boxes if you don't want to, or if you don't have all the information. Because I'm conscious that some people will lose a baby, but they'll not know what the sex is. And I think that needs to be flexible, and I would agree with that. Fair play, if it can be rolled out in June, I mean, I think that's a really good thing if all goes well in here. And I suppose I was going to ask a question in terms of launching it then, going live, what way you're going to communicate with people, what way you're even, I suppose, going to manage. You're saying you're building the capacity and you're looking at maybe around 5,000. And do you think a large part of that is likely to be retrospective? And I suppose my other question, just as we're talking here, because I don't know how far people will go back in that retrospective, but obviously in terms of mother and baby homes and I suppose just how women and children were treated across this island. Are things coming up even through some of those inquiries? Is there any information coming from there? And again, is that a particular area that we need to focus communication on, that this scheme, will be live in June? So just a couple of questions around that. And then I suppose, because my niece is raised through Irish, and I don't see it contested, but I understand the point you're making. And her name is completely Irish in terms of how she spells it. So if that was the case for families that are brought up with Irish as their first language, their names and stuff will be printed as it's spelt, yeah? It'll have the full...
That's
is
right.
there availability on the system to do that beyond the headings?
Yeah,
That's
so
what they choose. Yeah.
Sorry, so I'll start with your last point. So the information that appears on the certificate will be provided by individuals who are applying. So if they provide information in Irish, it'll appear in Irish. In respect of the comms, I think you make a really good point. I think we have not said very much publicly about the launch of the scheme because we're obviously in the latter stages of this. We need to make sure we can navigate the assembly process, committee here today, and get the IT system over the line. Once those things are in place, we'll begin to be more proactive about being clear about our launch. We have some plans to do so, to make the launch, including an event to launch it. We also have some comms to go out, in particular to the trusts, who will obviously be, the Health Trust will be one of the first ports of call for people as they're going through this to have information. They'll definitely need to have it there. In respect of how we're preparing, just over 5,000 applications I mentioned is the number that we have guesstimated. I wouldn't call it anything more than that at this stage, and that is more than would be suggested by the experience of the English scheme. As I say, we're expecting a lot of that demand to come in the first few weeks of the scheme, and so we have prepared in that first month to have more staff allocated to baby loss certificates than will be there for the remainder of the year. We expect this to settle down over the rest of this year, but we have, as I say, we have made preparations such that we can move staff across. We've made preparations such that the IT will be familiar for different people in different roles, so it should be possible to surge, have some surge capacity if we really need it. We will be cautious about making commitments about how quickly we'll get back to people in particularly those first few weeks, and then, as I say, we'll move into a more regular delivery schedule once things settle down. So that it is very difficult to estimate, and I really don't know what the take-up will be. We've just made the best estimate that I think we can under the circumstances and provided capacity to go beyond that without impacting the rest of the registration service. And I'm confident as I can be at this point that that's the right approach.
Thank you.
Okay, happy enough, Deirdre. A couple of just brief points, and we may take a comfort break. One is in relation to the population data which came out yesterday. So it's fairly stark for Northern Ireland. We have the, correct me if either of these statements are wrong, we have our median age is rising faster than it would appear any other jurisdiction on these islands, based on the most recent data. And we will soon have the highest median age, but also the highest proportion of people over 75 and 85, and also, as with Scotland, an overall decline in our population. Those are fairly stark numbers. And the stark, I'm not asking you to make any policy comment on any conclusions the policymakers should draw, Philip, but I suppose from a statistical perspective, can NISRA say that it was surprised by that, given that you track this data?
So I haven't come particularly prepared today to talk to these.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being willing to being bounced into the question.
I'm not going to take the invitation to correct you. I'll write to the committee if you're wrong in any of those assertions. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly the case that the population's ageing, and it's certainly the case that the population is expected to peak earlier than it was in those earlier projections. It's not a surprise, I suppose. The changes that happened between the set of projections that were released earlier this week and the previous set were relatively modest. The trends have been there for a little while. They've got much more attention this time, I think. So it wasn't a surprise. I think we've been talking in government about the impact of these changes in population. They're not forecasts, they are projections. So it is possible that policy will influence and impact on some of these. But there are big changes. There are expected to be many fewer kids in Northern Ireland in 20 or 30 years' time than there are today. And exactly as you say, there are expected to be many, many more people aged 70 and 80 and above. And that will have a profound impact on the nature of public services that need to be provided and
everything else
here.
Okay. Any other additional information you think the committee would benefit from? I think it is hugely important. I mean, it's very fiscally important. I'm going to do that. Yes. I have another annoying question to ask you that out with what you came here to talk about, and that relates to data that is gathered on sickness absence. We've just been told by the department, but we're not sure whether it's yourselves or the department that does it, that due to resource constraints, there's going to be a pause or a suspension of the gathering of quarterly data on sickness absence in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Are you aware of this? And is the resource gap in NISRA or the department or somewhere in the civil service centrally?
So we've had a number of discussions about what sickness absence is provided. The way this works, just to be clear, Chair, so we have a statistical team who are employed by NISRA who are seconded out to work, in this case, with HR colleagues. So there is a degree of separation between Colby House NISRA, if you like, and the statisticians in...
These are NISRA statisticians, but they're kind of seconded into the department to work on HR
right.
things.
So it's the same model as we would deploy to the Department for Communities or to the Department for Education, for example, where statisticians who are employed by us are seconded out. So I'm aware of some changes to the scope and scale of the sickness absence data that's being provided. I think there are a number of different pieces of work going on looking at sickness absence data in this team at the moment. So I'm aware of those too, but I wasn't aware of the specific suspension on account of resource constraints. I will take that away and ask.
It would be helpful if you write us, because we are concerned, as we're not just we are generally consumers of that data, but we also have a very specific interest because we have an inquiry which we're about to talk about in a few minutes on the Northern Ireland Civil Service, and one of the areas is sickness absence and management. So it would be helpful if you could tell us, if you can find out why that isn't being gathered in the same way that it was before. I think we're very interested.
Sure, it will be gathered. The question is whether or not it's being published in quite the way that it was previously, but I will write to committee to explain what exactly is going on there, yes.
And if it's not being published in the statistical release in the same way, I think we would still benefit from seeing that information, particularly in the context of our inquiry, if that's okay. Okay, so thank you very much. I think no one else has indicated that they wish to ask a question. Thank you, Philip and Aoife. So, members, we've agreed a couple of follow-ups that we're going to get information, I think, on the not in relation to baby loss. Were there any specific follow-ups we required?
Yeah, we're going to do all the things you basically suggested: the absence, population decline, and so on. Getting more detail on how the stats.
But in relation to the baby loss regulations, I don't think we had any other specific outstanding homework that was required. But members, we will copy the information on the certificates that we got today. Sorry, Deirdre.
Useful if they're going to do an event with the Minister, just to let the committee know as well.
Yes, that would be good. Yeah, that would be good. Definitely agree with that. Yeah, I think particularly given the role we all had in that, I think there's a lot of good, strong committee work on that. That would be, yes, if that does happen, I think we'd be keen to participate. So, members, I'm going to ask if you are content with the proposed statutory rule to provide the means to enable the provision of the baby loss certificate to those who have lost a baby prior to the end of the 24th week of pregnancy. Are you content with that? Okay. And we will publish, if we are agreed, the committee's decision in respect of the rule and notify the Department of Finance accordingly. Okay, members, another, I guess, milestone in terms of our work on this piece of legislation and delivering this for families and parents affected. We're just going to go into a very brief closed session to give people a comfort break.
Thank you. There we go. Yes, the officials are ready, so we're standing there.
Okay, members, now we're back in open session order. So at page 86, we're now going to talk about our banking and financial services inquiry report, which is a major part of, I suppose, the first year of this committee's work, first 18 months really, of our work whenever we came back in 2024. From page 86, there is an update. The paper started page 86, sorry, so we have a briefing paper from the Department of Finance at 86, copy of our own report at page 93, and they will update us. So we welcome officials to give us the update. We've got Wendy Lecky, Director of Strategic Policy Division, Julianne Kieran, Principal Economist in the Strategic Policy Division, and Dylan McDonnell, Deputy Principal Economist. You're all very welcome. Thank you for coming. And Wendy, if you'd give us an opening statement, and members indicate if you want to ask a question. We're very welcome, but we're very grateful that you've come because this has been a really important priority for the committee, and we want to ensure that there's follow through in the recommendations. So thank you for coming, and go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair, Deputy Chair, and members for the opportunity today to discuss the Department's work in relation to banking. As you pointed out, Chair, I have with me today Julianne and Dylan, who support our work in the Department on access to cash. I suppose we're all fully aware that banking is a reserved matter. However, as you would all agree, that doesn't mean that we should leave all the delivery and all the action to those with the responsibility for regulation and legislation on banking across in London. It's hugely important that those with that responsibility, so the Treasury, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the banks themselves, are aware of our particular circumstances and issues. So the Finance Minister's role and that of my team in this area is really around, firstly, on engagement, providing stakeholders with a platform to raise issues, and then secondly, pressing on those who make the decisions for accountability and solutions to those issues. And this has become more important than ever. You'll be all aware of the evolving nature of the banking sector, with the continuing closure of the traditional brick and mortar bank branches and a move towards online banking services. And although that digital shift is welcomed by many, it does present issues for many other citizens who still require that access to in-person advice and services. And bank branches can have a disproportionate impact on certain groups. You'll be aware of older people, those that have limited digital skills, and then the impact that it has on our rural and cross-border communities, and where charities, for example, have their own particular issues that you're aware of. So it's really, really important that those groups have a representation and a voice. And the key vehicle really for doing that in DOF is through our Ministers' Banking Roundtable, where the most recent one was held on the 3rd of December last year. And as you will have seen in the report that was published earlier this month, some of the issues in that report align very closely to those identified through the committee's own inquiry. And following the publication, or on the day of publication of the report, the Minister shared that report with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Chief Executive of the Financial Conduct Authority, with a number of asks, particularly seeking full transparency on the cash access assessments and the decisions around that, and asked to review the use of the data that they use for Northern Ireland and the criteria that they use. He also asked that there would be further protections around other banking services, not just access to cash, and what plans that Treasury have in place to protect the use of cash, as we've seen is now being rolled out in other countries. So we await a response on those. However, we do recognise, as the committee did as well, that there are actions that can be taken locally here, particularly around financial and digital inclusion. And you'll have seen the update in the paper that we provided, that that's a cross-cutting issue as well. It's not just a DOF issue, but it's an area that we in DOF are very proactive in engaging with other departments on. For example, we're in the process of setting up a cross-departmental working group with DFC to look at financial inclusion. And as you appreciate from your own inquiry, that's a key issue for stakeholders. And the UK level financial inclusion strategy, we were very disappointed to see that it didn't sufficiently reflect our own local circumstances. In fact, it didn't really reflect many at all. In addition, this is an area where we work in partnership with Libraries NI and supporting Communities NI, where DOF's Digital Inclusion Unit deliver workshops in local libraries, community centres and hubs to help individuals build those digital skills and improve financial inclusion. And as part of your inquiry, you had engaged with Malile Community Association, and we have that engagement with them as well, given their involvement in the Community Access to Cash pilot. They have been invited to all 3 of the Banking Roundtable events, and we met with them again last November following your inquiry to explore further lessons that can be learnt, particularly around financial education. A number of your recommendations in your inquiry also relate to community-based lending and making use of dormant assets and financial transactions capital, and we have provided updates in those in our report for today. And we share your concerns as well around the increasing cost of insurance premiums. We've been engaging with industry on that as well to understand the main factors behind those, so that those can be considered by the relevant departments. Again, that is a cross-cutting issue, but also by the right administration. And we've been pushing the industry as well for better data, particularly so that we can benchmark ourselves against Great Britain. So there's more detailed updates, I suppose, in the paper that was provided on your recommendations, and we're happy to take any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, first of all, it's welcome that the banking roundtables will continue and that the department, I suppose, accepts the committee's view, which was, in a sense, the purpose of the inquiry. And one of the biggest outcomes of the inquiry is we need to shout about our needs here, because the Treasury and the FCA are simply not, that's not necessarily a sin of Commission. They may be cynical in relation to public spending, but they're just not, in many cases, blissfully unaware of our specific needs, whether that's rurality or frontier workers and cross-border issues or access to cash issues. You know, we might as well be on the moon, basically, on some of these issues. So I suppose my first question is, has there been a step change in terms of both post our inquiry, but also the existence of the banking roundtables in terms of actually making that voice heard and, in a sense, demanding input a bit more from the department to the relevant bodies in London, whether that's the Treasury, the FCA, or in some cases, I suppose, the PRA, or indeed the commercial banks themselves? So
I would say the relationship we have with the FCA is reasonably good. There's now a local representation here as well in Northern Ireland, and we meet with them regularly. The FCA have attended our last 2 banking roundtable events, and that engagement just doesn't happen there. The Minister, for example, last year as well, whenever they were launching their new 5-year strategy, the FCA had an event in Belfast, so the Minister attended that and gave a keynote speech. I also went across in October. The FCA were holding a forum, it was like a Chatham House Rule forum, of bringing together stakeholders to see how the access to cash rules have been implemented. So I would say it's good on the FCA part. On the Treasury part, unfortunately, I would say it's not as successful. We do share the reports with Treasury. As far as I'm aware, we didn't get a response from the one from last year.
The bank, when you say you didn't get a response, did they acknowledge that you had sent it, or was it just like, you sent, they didn't acknowledge? So this is just like sending an email to info@ and they just ignored it? I'm sure you sent it to a named person, and but you're
sent to the CST. So the minister writes to the CST, shares the report, and will set out within that a number of asks or things that the CST should consider. We didn't get a response to that last year. He did the same again whenever we published our report this year. And as I said in my sort of opening remarks, we await a response on that.
Is it definitely the CST? Because would that be is that the right person to send it to, or I mean, there's no excuse for them not responding, but
they're responsible for the legislation, so that the FCA then manage and regulate. So they would be. We filter our queries of what we're raising, what we're highlighting through the letters. So there'll be things specific to the Treasury that we're raising.
And we know that they get it because of our engagement with Treasury officials, who have also been invited to.
You ask for a read receipt of the email that they then don't respond to? I'm not being flippant, but it sounds like that's pretty contemptuous.
Well, the officials are aware that the Minister has written to the CST. They're aware of the content of the letter. But they haven't responded.
And just on a few specific things then, that is like frustrating. I think it might be for our committee to think about ways that we escalate and make clear that there is an outstanding, to the extent that our voice can be heard too. So some of the specific issues and recommendations raised by our own inquiry, and it didn't come. So one of the things that came up, it was, and you did actually mention in your opening statement, there was the Financial Inclusion Committee and Strategy, and basically the lack of a Northern Ireland presence on it. When you have asked about that, is the answer just talk to the hand, not interested, or?
No response, really. Our minister and a couple of other ministers from here did write across to ask for representation on that committee, on the Financial Inclusion Strategy Committee. We did have one representation here from Northern Ireland from the Consumer Council on one of the subcommittees around access to credit. But apart from that, we didn't have a representative on the main committee. Now, DFC were the lead on that in terms of from here, in terms of the engagement and going back.
Engagement as in responding to the consultation for the financial inclusion,
well, not even responding, just liaising with officials as Treasury officials were taking that financial inclusion strategy forward.
It was raised in the letter last year and this year about representation on committees.
One of the other, say that again, Julianne.
It was raised this year and last year about an Northern Ireland representative needing to be on relevant committees like the Financial Inclusion Strategy Committee.
And you met that devolved officials now, I presume, and I presume their view, although they maybe haven't articulated, just that this is reserved, so we're cracking on, or you don't know?
I don't think we know, but I think the fact that the Financial Inclusion Strategy, when it was published, didn't really have anything in detail for Northern Ireland. I think that's quite clear that they weren't interested.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and I guess then it makes it even more important that we collectively, whether that's the executive or just representatives here, make our voice heard. On that. I know there's some talk, I don't know if it's confirmed, that there'll be what's called a King's Speech fairly soon, and there may be a financial services bill. I've heard some reporting that might be one of the things that's included. Is there an argument for the executive taking a position on specific interventions that might be, that they would want to see? I don't know if there's any planning gone into that.
Not that I'm aware of.
On the question of cross-border banking, because that was a theme that came up again and again, and is definitely one of the very particular issues that frontier workers, people who are resident in one jurisdiction on the island and perhaps they're self-employed and there are multiple different or they work in Dublin and they need to get a mortgage in the north or whatever. Did that come up at the banking round table, and what specific actions are being taken?
So there was an issue that came up in the banking round table just around the criteria that Link use whenever they're undertaking their cash access assessments around cross-border, and to what extent they include that sort of cross-border transactions. So we take Crossmaglen, for example. The Minister and I were out there in January. They had made a bid for a hub in September 2024.
A banking hub, yeah.
A banking hub, sorry, yes, which was unsuccessful. But when we looked more and more into the criteria that are used, it's a 3 mile radius. They look at a 3 mile radius for rural areas like Crossmaglen, but that stops at the border. So a town like that that's right on the border, it's not really a 3 mile radius.
No, it's,
so that's something as well.
Yeah.
Our Minister has raised directly now with the FCA, asking that they review the criteria that they use here for Northern Ireland to see if they're appropriate, and to be more transparent as well around those decisions.
For the Minister, or maybe this committee, writing to, we had, for example, Bank of Ireland and AIB in front of us here, and they will say that post-Brexit, and there's new challenges, but it is simply harder to get. I mean, I speak from, you know, not personal experience, but close family experience of people who, you know, trying to get a euro mortgage for a house in Belfast, despite the fact that there's a huge number of people who live in not just Belfast, but Newry, Banbridge, all that, whose day jobs are in Dublin now, and then people who are always traditionally worked on one side of the border. And it's obviously harder. Some of that will be the regulatory and political or the legal environment, but some of that is commercial choice by banks. Is there an argument for the Minister writing to the commercial, to the banks and saying, what are you doing to make it easier for your customers who operate on a cross-border basis, and even the Irish government or regulators in the Republic?
Yeah, so we deal directly mostly with UK Finance, who are the representative body, and that's something we can certainly pick up directly with them. If you think that would be useful, if you're hearing that there are those issues, we would be happy to take that away and do that.
Personally, I do think that would be useful, because I think a lot of the member bodies in UK Finance will be perhaps there, and obviously we know now because of the loss of passporting rights, they're organised slightly differently than they were pre-Brexit, certainly the All-Ireland banks, and those are the ones who are mainly providing these services, the AIBs, the not Ulster anymore as we know, but the AIB, Bank of Ireland. But I do think that question coming from, because we know now it's not going to come from the Treasury. It may come from the FCA, but it's not going to come. So I think that's a really critical question. But thank you for that. I think there are...
Chair, I would just wanted to add as well,
yeah.
The Minister also shared the report with his counterpart in the Republic of Ireland, and has asked...
Our report? Or,
yes, well, our report, sorry, our banking report, and has asked that his officials link in with us so that we can discuss those sorts of issues as well. We're waiting to hear back on that, but appreciate that.
You keep us posted on that. This is their counterpart, in the Department of Finance in Dublin? Yeah. Okay, I think it would be helpful to be kept abreast of that, because I just think there's a real, I think there's a clear policy gap here in terms of frontier workers and financial services for them, and it came out in our report, but we just need to make clear that. One final one for me is on claims management in relation to higher motor insurance premiums.
Yes.
Is there a specific position that the department or the executive has on regulation of claims management companies?
So most people might all be aware, so it's regulated across the water, it's not regulated here. That is something that has been raised with the Minister directly by the insurance industry. We have asked that they provide us with the evidence before the Minister would consider it, to what extent it is actually an issue. Whenever the Motor Insurance Task Force was also been taken forward across the water, they had asked the industry for that same evidence. We're still waiting on that. They do tell us, the ABI tell us that they're working on it. We link in with them regularly, and they seem quite confident that we will get something on that soon. So I think once we have that sort of data to back up if it is an issue here and if it's worth legislating for, that's whenever the Minister then would consider that. And the Minister is committed to looking at that whenever it's received.
I'm going to bring it others now. No one else has indicated. Deirdre Hardy.
Yes, no, thanks very much. It's probably an area that maybe isn't really on, but obviously we tried to look at it as part of the inquiry around the talk of a mutual bank, and it's just to see if there was a follow-up report. I see Preston Council in England and around Lancashire and stuff have just actually invested for the first time in shares into a community mutual bank there. And now it's not going to be established. They're applying for the licence, I believe, in Q3 of this financial year, and then to be fully operational in 2027. So I would be keen to see any learning that comes from that, and particularly in the context. I mean, their big focus is to keep any profit that's gained through transactions, and particularly through public procurement, that's recycled back into the local economy and not extracted. And particularly when you look at the banking system here, which is private firms, up to 80% in some banks of their profits go back to the shareholders, and it goes out of the local economy. And particularly when we look at a public procurement expenditure here, 4 billion, well up to 4 billion in terms of the executive. Like if all of those were being banked in a community mutual bank or that type of bank where you're recycling that profit, I think then if there's learning from that, and that's an approach that we could start to develop, I think it would be good. So if we could see at some point in the future how that pilot in Preston's going, I'd be keen for us to be updated on that as well.
Okay, Deirdre, so this is something that was raised with the Department of Finance a few years back, and where it was left was then with DFE, that they were going to look about funding a feasibility study into a mutual bank here in Northern Ireland. I don't know where that got to. That's a couple of years now, but we can pick that up with officials.
Yeah, or we can either via you or via the can ask that. Is with that okay? Hi, Harvey. What's the
Brian first.
Oh, sorry, Brian,
and then
Harry.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, we've had a growth in these online banks in recent years, and I do feel sorry for the banks which were traditionally high street, and provided branches. Sadly, those are obviously reducing. But
still making profits, Brian. No, I wouldn't feel sorry for them necessarily.
But no, well, in fairness to them, I do like to support the banks that have a high street presence, and then
building society
and actually provide some where physically people can meet with them. Is there any way that government compensates for that for the banks that are just purely online, that they should pay some extra dividend, towards supporting physical presence, whether that's a banking hub? Is there anything that's done to compensate for the fact, as I say, those purely online banks?
The challenger banks, they're not a designated bank by the FCA, so they don't currently pay for banking hubs. It would be the ones that you see physically that are currently paying for it. I think they still have the biggest market share overall in the UK, but I don't know if there's any. That would be an FCA decision, I think, to do anything like that.
But there's no way of, as I say, getting extra funding from them, some form to, as I say, support a physical presence, banking hubs, that sort of thing.
They're in the legislation there was like designated banks. I think there's 14 in the UK, so all the high street banks here that you would see are in that list, and they collectively fund like Cash Access UK, who would roll out banking hubs, but there's no challenger banks like listed on as designated at this time. I don't know about I don't know if there's any plans by Treasury to increase tax or dividends or anything like that. We're not aware of anything. On the
Can you say challenger banks?
Yeah, that's like another name. They don't have a physical bank presence.
Okay, wasn't aware of that. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi, Harvey.
Thank you, Chair. I think that's a very interesting point that you made, Wendy, in relation to the 3 mile radius, because when you think about it, like usually that would be a 6 mile circle. So I think it should be looked at that. I mean, it should still be a 6 mile circle, but your centre point should be at the edge. Maybe if it should be allowance for that. I think that's very interesting. Never thought of that, but being right on the edge, and you've only half the distance literally to go down. Very good point.
Yeah, no, it is an issue that we have raised, and the FCA, we've raised it with the FCA as well. Yeah. The FCA are going to be doing a review towards the end of this year of the access to cash rules and how they're rolling out, and if there's no sort of movement on that by then, that'll be another opportunity for us as a department, but also the committee, I suppose, to try and get be part of that review, and put forward those sorts of issues.
And you've identified a couple of towns that would fall into that, so like it's... Yeah.
Lisnaskea was another one. So Lisnaskea and Crossmaglen are two areas that we're aware of where they've applied for a banking hub and have been turned down.
And easily rectified, as I say, just instead of moving your town or your bank and hub to the centre to one edge and still the same. Yeah, very good. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, no further members have indicated that they wish to ask a question. I am very keen that we hear more about this, that we keep on top of it as a committee. I think there's several things. Thank you for coming and briefing us. I think it's welcome that the banking roundtable still exists. I'm really keen that we as a committee and yourselves, the department, appreciating the two things that I think we have all established. Number one, we have very particular needs here. Rurality, access to cash, cross-border issues, including, by the way, some of the things in terms of business banking that came out around, like a high number of traditional multi-generational family companies, and there's a question about whether they're served as well as they perhaps used to be or could be by, in terms of business banks. We also know, it hasn't really come up today, but we have a large community and voluntary sector who are facing the challenges of getting bank accounts in the first place, then transitioning the bank accounts when somebody who is in their 80s or more, who sadly passes on and has been the account named person since 1970 or 80 something, and they need to transition that to another person. All those are things which are particular, they exist across the water too, but we have particular exposure to them. So we do want to kind of, as it were, keep on top of it, and therefore keep on top of like what you guys are doing. So if you could send us updates on financial services, further what we've discussed, and members and clerk, keep me right if I've forgotten anything. If there are any more legislative developments in London in relation to a bill, including financial services, or any other outworkings of the Financial Inclusion Committee, which I appreciate and I acknowledge you've been trying to get an in on, but whether there's any more shouting that can be done in terms of being heard on that, number one. Number two, you mentioned that taking away on cross-border services, particularly for frontier workers, whether that's mortgages or even just everyday current accounts for people who are frontier workers and proximate to the border generally. You obviously mentioned the cash access, branch access issue for places like Crossmaglen and Listonskey, but there's a broader issue for frontier workers. And if the Minister or the Department is going to raise that, you mentioned with the Irish Government, but also with the banks themselves, and see what they're doing, because I think one of the things we found out with our inquiry was, to be honest, once we asked them to come here, they kind of had to, no offence, then pull their socks up a wee bit and have some answers ready for us, because they weren't used to being asked to come and account for some of the services here, with the exception of the round table, but they were doing it in public here. So and please feel free to attach our report and say that the Assembly Committee is going to keep making noise about it too. Claims management companies and where regulation is on that, and if there's, so we do want to see that things come forward, or the work that's being, the evidence base I think you've asked the ABI for. If we could be copied into that, or at least give us your analysis of it, that would be helpful. And then finally, Deirdre raised the point about mutual banks. I'm not trying to send you out too much, I don't want to create loads of work streams, but this is really updating us on existing ones. Mutual banks, whether that feasibility study was commissioned and what the outworking of it was, and also where we are. I'm not sure where we are with credit unions, because that's a related matter. Both of those will go via the Department of Economy, but if we could be kept updated on all of them, that would be most helpful. If members are content, we ask the Department for that. I also think, members, it's worth us corresponding with the Treasury. I can't remember, I presume we did at some point. We got a response.
We did, yeah. We didn't get much of a response.
And I don't know whether it's the Chief Secretary or whoever, the Financial Services Minister, whatever it might be, the Exchequer Secretary, or there was something. Well, yes, but that's not always the. Anyway,
they usually are good at transferring.
Whoever we read it to, if we could say that, as the Assembly Finance Committee, we are concerned about the failure to understand financial services issues that are particular and, particularly in Northern Ireland. The Ministers established a bank roundtable. We dedicated a particular inquiry, but it has proven very difficult to get with. To be fair, the part exception of the FCA, who do engage a bit more, to get response and engagement on this. Can you please, flag it with them and attach the report and ask for a repeat our concern response? And it may be worth us copying that to either the NI Affairs Committee or the Treasury Select Committee.
Probably both wouldn't hurt, Chair.
Yeah, I know there's no NI presence on the Treasury Select Committee, but it might both of those, and then we can follow up again in some weeks' time to see if we've. But I think we can write that with a bit of pepper, as it were, so that they know we want a response. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. If members are agreed with that. Thanks very much. Okay. I think there might have been, yeah, but would be. So, Dylan is the local representative, but he can advise on who would be happy to get the guys. I think came and give us that. Probably would, to be honest.
Yeah. They seemed keen.
They came back. I mean, okay. So, members, agenda item 8 is leading and resourcing. And next, I'm just going to retrospectively do something I didn't do because before I'm assaulted by one of the clerks, we were agreed that we were all going to Hansard both this and the last thing. We've agreed.
Agreed.
Okay. Agenda item 8 is leading and resourcing in the NI Civil Service. We're going to get a pre-brief from the NI Audit Office, and then after that we will got an oral briefing, and then after that we'll go into closed session. Should we need to?
Yeah.
Because obviously, as is the practice in the PAC, where there's information that's best shared in closed session for whatever reason, we're content to do that. But we'll start off an open session if that's okay with you. Dorinnia. Okay. So members, at page 150 of the meeting pack, there's a clerk's memo on this oral briefing, which is on the NIAO report, leading and resourcing the Northern Ireland Civil Service. There's a briefing paper from the NIAO, which is page 152. The report itself is on page 166. Correspondence from NISRA regarding the inquiry and request for oral evidence, and a process evaluation report on the AO pilot recruitment competition at page 33 of the table pack. We'll discuss, we won't discuss the last two items now, we'll discuss them if necessary afterwards. It's also worth saying, members, if you have computers in front of you and if you need to, the 2019 or 2020 report on capacity and capability might also be a useful aid memoir, because there's a logical follow through. You may even, if you have loads of room in your hard drive, you could even look at the RCI inquiry report, but you might not have that level of download capacity on your device. But thank you very much to Dorinnia Carville, who's on a break from the PAC and the team. To the Finance Committee on the PAC, Dorinnia Carville is the Comptroller and Auditor General. Suzanne Jones, who's Director at the Director at the Audit Office, and Laura Murphy, who's Audit Manager at the Audit Office. As I say, members, we may go into a short closed session at some stage if it's necessary and useful, but for the time being we're in open session. So if you would, Dorinnia, please give us an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members, for inviting us here today and for recognition of our report into leading and resourcing the civil service. We've provided committee with a high-level brief, as Chair has outlined, and I'm joined today by Suzanne and Laura, who were both involved in actually writing the report, and together we can provide you with any additional information you have as is of interest to your inquiry. Rather than outline the report's findings to you, because I know you've had a number of briefs on that, I would just like to take this opportunity, if I may, to brief you as to why I decided to report on this area. So the committee will be aware that as Controller and Auditor General and as an officer of the House, I am totally independent in choosing what I report on with regard to my public reporting and value for money studies within the confines of a statutory remit, where I consider the efficiency, effectiveness and economy of how public money is spent without assessing any policy associated with it. And you'll also be aware, as the Chair has said, a previous report of the Audit Office entitled Capacity and Capability of the Civil Service was produced in 2019. The then Public Accounts Committee held an inquiry in that report in 2020, and 11 of the 12 recommendations of the PAC report were accepted in full by the Civil Service. Over the course then of this mandate, as the Chair said in his opening brief, I work very closely with the Public Accounts Committee, and during this mandate I have heard firsthand many senior public officials coming in front of that committee advising of a lack of resources impacting on public service delivery, advising of significant amounts of vacant posts impacting on the delivery of key objectives, and advising on a lack of skills in particular areas which again are impacting on public service delivery. And this was something that I was also being repeatedly advised about by departments in many of my own areas of work as well. And also we evidenced during our financial audit work that 7 out of 9 departments were identifying people as a key corporate risk. So with all of this evidence being provided by officials around the impacts of resourcing pressures, it caused me to look back at that capacity and capability report that was previously done by my office and then the report of the Public Accounts Committee. And in looking at those, I felt that the recommendations of both of those reports should have assisted in remedying the issues that were being presented. And therefore I commenced a piece of work to look then importantly at what actions had been taken to progress the recommendations of those previous reports and recommendations that were previously committed to by the leadership of the civil service and what impact those actions had made. In designing the scope of this report, I did want to then focus on updating it for changes to the civil service in recent years, as well as changes to the modern workforce landscape more generally, which is why this report into leading and resourcing picked up in some areas not previously spotlighted. And when we commenced looking into this area, we quickly found that the recommendations of those previous reports remained sound and applicable to the modern workforce needs, but that there has been little progress in actually actioning those recommendations to date. Very quickly carrying out the study, we recognised that the overarching recommendation of this report would be essentially to re-recommend implementation of the previous Audit Office and PAC reports.
For the record, that's the original NIAO report is November 2020.
November 2020, sorry, I said 2019.
Sorry, yes. Sorry, is that I just want to make sure I'm quoting it correctly. The capacity and capability report was November 2020.
2020, yeah. Right. And so during the course then of our examination, the NICS did progress the people strategy and have incorporated those recommendations into that strategy document. So just to finish, our latest report makes only 7 recommendations, but if I can summarise, they focus on a need for the leadership to work collectively to deliver the people strategy, and in doing so the recommendations of those previous reports, to maximise the opportunities that emerging technologies bring, and ultimately to design and plan for a workforce that is suitably skilled to deliver the modern requirements of public service in a most efficient and effective way possible. Certainly I believe, Chair, that there is a real opportunity here to provide a modern and skilled workforce and to importantly establish the underlying data to measure and then evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness of that workforce, allowing the leaders to use that data to continually measure and re-evaluate the changing nature of public services and importantly have the agility to adapt to what is a constantly changing environment. The people strategy provides a roadmap to achieve it, but implementation and delivery are now critical. And I'll stop there, Chair, and happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you very much. And members, as always, indicate if you wish to ask a question. You said that you're, in essence, the 2026 report not simply, but re-recommended what was in the 2020 report. Are we to understand from that the view of the NIAO report is that no progress or not enough progress has been made in the intervening 6 years, or 5.5 years?
We have said that progress has been much slower than we expected, and I actually went so far as to say it fell short of expectation. We do go into detail. We did do a detailed analysis in the appendix of that report where we have recognised that there has been some progress, but slower than expected.
When you say some progress, is it worth picking out so I don't get accused of being wholly negative? Which particular? So 5 out of the 5 have been achieved out of the 23. And whenever we took evidence from the people in charge of the next people strategy, they were at pains to point out that 5 out of 23, not to paraphrase Meatloaf, but I'm not sure too many people would say 5 out of 23 ain't bad. I don't think it's that good. Is that fair?
We point out in relation to our report 5 achieved, 13 partially achieved and 5 not achieved. So we have tried to give recognition where recognition is due. Similarly, in the PAC's then report in 2021, 5 achieved, 5 partially achieved and 2 not achieved.
So one of the most persistent issues that comes out of your report is people in general, but one of the issues is sickness absence and high absence levels. That appears to be getting worse. Now, there may be multiple drivers of it, and we know that there's been higher incidence of, for example, mental ill health in the last number of years post-COVID. And obviously civil servants in many cases are working with significant burdens on them. The service is carrying vacancies, etc. What would be your observations in terms of that? It appears that we're going in the wrong direction in terms of absences.
We do point out in our report, as you say, there is increase in the actual days, an increase in cost, but that correlates to pay increases over the period. We do compare that to England, Scotland and Wales, and I know previous witnesses have said that not everyone measures sickness absent in exactly the same manner, but the NICS is, at the time of our report, 70% higher than the rest of the UK in terms of sickness absence. One thing I would point out is mental ill health is the main cause of absence, and that is consistent across public and private sectors. There are areas, however, that I would bring to the committee's attention. I think we point out in our report. I know you've picked up on previously, Chair, around the age of the workforce. NISRA highlight a link between sickness absence and age. And again, we highlight that over the course of the period between our previous report, the average age has stayed somewhat the same, and the average age of the senior civil service has actually got older. So that is one contributory factor. We also point out in our report that within that category of mental ill health as the main cause of absence, some 32% is related to work-related stress.
32% of the mental ill health is related to work stress?
Yes.
So a third basically of mental ill health reported meaning reported as a cause of a vacancy, or just in general, do we know?
Not necessarily as a cause of a vacancy. So mental ill health leading cause of sickness absence, accounting for almost 42% of the working days lost, and of that 32% is attributed to work-related stress. So 32% of the 41% of days lost. Sorry, just to correct myself.
Yeah. Okay. On the workforce plan, there's a NICS-wide people strategy, and there will be then a NICS-wide workforce plan. One of the issues that keeps coming back here is the slightly strange situation where we have overall ownership of the people strategy by senior officials in the Department of Finance for the civil service overall, but then, as it were, individual HR policies being owned individually by accounting officers, and a kind of sense that, and there's a question about the role of the head of the civil service, who doesn't currently appear to have who's the head of the civil service, but doesn't appear to have a kind of direct line or a direct accountability for for improving metrics in relation to HR and workforce. Is that a concern? It just appears to be an anomaly, basically. It keeps coming up that finance has responsibility for the policy overall, but there's no real or not enough central ownership of the levers to drive it across the civil service, because accounting officers and their HR directors are kind of individually responsible. Is that a challenge that do you think that you have seen?
I think there's a couple of things I would comment on that, and certainly through our work and the work of the Public Accounts Committee, I think the idea of this, the silos and the current construct of the civil service does come up repeatedly. I would slightly disagree with the contention that the Hawks, the head of the civil service, has no accountability and no role, because there's a very clear role that we point out for the next board, of which the head of the civil service is the chair of that board, but that board does then incorporate all of the permanent secretaries, all of the accounting officers who are heading up each of those individual departments. So there is a collective responsibility at that next board level, and you can see that in the response to the previous report that the Public Accounts Committee did on capacity and capability, where the response that, albeit written by the Department of Finance and coming through the Finance Minister, who has the ultimate responsibility, it does say at the outset of that response that the head of the civil service and the next board have been consulted and agree with all of the responses contained within. So there's recognition there that there is accountability at next board and head of the civil service level.
Obviously the next board is reconstituted, and it is somewhat more independent in terms of it has independent NAIDs.
Yes, there are 3 NAIDs on the that have been recruited onto the next board, and then 3 subcommittees have been set up by the head of the civil service and the board, and one of those subcommittees does have a particular focus on people and progressing the people strategy in conjunction with the board itself.
Okay. I'm going to bring in other members now. Deputy Chair, first of all.
Thanks very much, Chair, and good to see you all in Finance Committee for a change, not Public Accounts Committee, but thank you very much for coming to speak to us on this. You had talked about the underlying data and the importance of that in terms of all of this, managing the efficiency and effectiveness, monitoring it, and just seeing what exactly is going on. I'd asked a number of questions that I was quite surprised to not be able to get the information on. For example, one recently in terms of the number of vacancies, how many are being filled by people on temporary promotion or how many are filled by people on agency, and I'm just getting answers like we don't hold that sort of information. To me that feels like quite basic information. So whenever you're saying underlying data, are you talking about that sort of quite basic information isn't available, or are you talking more in terms of complexity? Because I was quite shocked that I thought that was quite a simple thing to have asked for. So I just wonder if you could give a bit more detail around that.
As in the context of our work more widely, we probably raise concerns around data, I think, in almost every report that I've written since coming into post. I made those comments in the context of where we go from here. So, and I know the committee have already been briefed on the Integrate project, and there's real opportunity then for Integrate to ensure that we do have levels of data going forward that will allow us to produce exactly, what you're asking for instantly as well. But there is, and I know it's available in the public domain, evidence was given to the Public Accounts Committee just last week on that project as well, where the SRO, Mr Duffy, gave evidence around the work that is ongoing to ensure that the data going in there is fit for purpose going forward. So we have one of our recommendations in our leading and resourcing around ensuring that there is suitable data available, suitable metrics available going forward to really focus on measuring productivity. Obviously, from my perspective, it's about coming back to the value for money of the workforce and making sure we have the most efficient and effective workforce to deliver those modern public service needs. So comments are in the context of where we go from here more so, but yes, I've many reports where I could point you to that says current data is inadequate. I don't know if you guys want to add anything in relation to this. Okay.
Yeah, no, and it was really useful for us to be out at Integrate and understand and see what it's going to look like. But at the same time, even though that's going to be more user friendly and and clicking it in a particular way, that data is there, and to me it feels quite shocking and not good enough that nobody's really assessing that properly at the minute, and it shouldn't require you to come in as an external auditor to look at that. If you're managing your own functionality, you should be able to get that, especially when you've got £1.27 billion of your annual pay bill in the civil service. So you talked a little bit about the workforce metrics. Would it be fair to say that it's difficult for you to actually assess if there is value for money on that level of spend with the existing metrics?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we wanted to do at the outset of this, we started looking at this not that long after a report had been published by NISRA in the south around productivity levels between the north and the south, and we're showing that Northern Ireland as a whole had very different levels of workforce productivity. I had hoped when we were looking at this that we could have drilled into that in the public sector, but unfortunately the data was not there to enable me to do that in any way that I could draw any meaningful conclusions from that. So it was a piece of work that I wasn't able to report on, which was very disappointing. I would like, and that's what really drives that last recommendation in the current report, because I think that is a position that we should be able to get to in the future and be able to then compare it to other jurisdictions.
This is a key point where we've got a higher percentage of people employed in the public sector here in Northern Ireland compared to anywhere else in the UK. We've got this huge pay bill, yet the metrics don't allow you to actually assess whether it's value for money. It's not a good place to be in, and it'll be good to tease this out more as we go through this inquiry. The other thing I just wanted to ask was around the agency staff and the framework. So obviously there's this big framework, and it's about £500 million in terms of the valuation they put on this framework. I understand it's about 4,900 agency staff employed. Half of them are through the DWP contract. But in terms of the actual agency framework, do you think that putting out for procurement for such a huge value, wide-ranging agency framework is the most appropriate way to approach that? Or just as we're looking at individual departments, you have different types of vacancies, you have different types of specialism, you have different types of agency staff, and you might be able to get people on temporary contracts, recruit at more of a localised level, whereas not every business or agency or firm are able to actually put in a bid for procurement for such a huge agency framework. So effectively you're pricing a lot of your potential workforce out of the market.
We didn't in this particular report look at the framework and the methods, for recruitment in that way. I suppose one of the things that we were, because we were coming at it from a value for money perspective, really, we were looking just more at the actual use and cost of agency staff and the impact that was having as well, because the high levels, and what we were pointing out in this report is the levels of agency staff have more than doubled over the 5-year period from our previous one. We didn't really look at that framework, but more we're trying to draw out how short term the use of agency staff was. It was impacting a number of factors, recruitment couldn't keep pace, but it was putting an awful lot of pressure on the system as well. There's an additional time and training cost that goes with agency staff. But sorry, to answer your question directly, we probably haven't got the evidence to really comment fully on that particular framework. We are doing another piece of work currently looking at temporary and agency nurses as a workforce, and we're going into looking at the framework and the methodology underpinning that. So that is going to publish now, hopefully within the next month, and it'll fall under the primacy of PAC in the first instance. I'll put that out
No,
there.
thank you very much. And I just think it's that data piece again, you know, in terms of your agency, what people are doing, what they're covering, and all those things that you said, to be able to extract that and assess it. But under the current metrics, you can't really see it. But thank you very much, very useful. Thank you.
Okay, now Brian Kingston.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you again for your attendance and the report, which is helpful to us. And you focused on key recommendations for us, so that assists us in our own inquiry. Certainly, with over 24,500 staff, it goes out saying it's important. There's very effective management, deployment, monitoring, you know, of how staff are deployed and how they're supported in their role. So I think it's fair to say your report shows that the progress since your previous report has been disappointing, and it's how we get into the detail, you know, with such a large workforce, about what changes need to be made, and to as well as like high-level broad brush proposals, getting into the detail of it. I mean, we've had 2 recent visits, as you've heard, with Integrate, you know, around HR services, financial services, and also at LPS, or Land Property Services, particularly around land registries, seeing how a lot of that is paper-based. Were you able to go into actually looking at the internal workings of any departments, you know, and looking at actual transformation reform processes such as Integrate, or would you say it was more higher level, you know, looking at big data and more strategic changes?
For the purposes of this report, it was, as you described, that more high-level overview, and really trying to make sure that strategically we address the right skills that are needed to try and address the resource and pressures that were coming from the current situation. We do go in other areas of our work. We do go into the detail a little bit more, but for the purposes of this report, we did purposely keep it high level. We do, where there were comparatives to be made, we do have some tables within the report looking at what particular departments were experiencing most vacancies or the most temporary promotions, for example, and we do highlight those. Again, we comment probably not on every individual one, but on just some of the bigger ones. For example, you know, the DFC being, you know, the biggest department in terms of people head count, in terms of vacancy. The DWP contract's a big factor in that. But we didn't delve down into much detail in any one individual department.
Yeah. Oh, no, I can understand that, and it's similar to our role that, you know, we want to make effective change. And it's how we do that without having to visit every department or every work team, but clearly that we have that scrutiny role, you know, and ask the challenging questions. So, I mean, one of the frustrations earlier this meeting was on sickness absence data, you know, and hearing that there's been no quarterly report published by NISRA since 2024, October to November 2024. So, I mean, and you've highlighted that the average number of work days lost due to sickness absence has increased since your previous report. 13.4 average working days lost per staff. Equally, you say that more than half of staff recorded 0 sickness absence in year, and 81.7% of days lost are a result of long-term sickness absence. So, did you have any difficulty receiving the data? We're concerned about that, you know, the publication of data that has not been taking place for 16 months. Did you have any difficulty in that terms? And have you any particular comments on addressing sickness absence, of actions, you know, recommendations in relation to that?
In terms of the data, we use the NISRA data on their website. So obviously we were looking at it on an annual basis rather than quarterly or half yearly. So the information was available for us.
Okay.
And I think, I suppose, the only comment we didn't get into, the one comment I would make about, I think, why we pointed out that long-term absence was such a high percentage, because long-term absence is generally, and the Audit Office has done work looking at sickness absence in the past, long-term absence can be more difficult to address for any employer. Short-term absences are where typically an employer can make inroads into management of that more quickly and more easily, but obviously, you know, long-term absences, long-term prolonged illnesses can be more difficult. We are likely to report this year in what I call my general report, if you like, on absence levels across the civil service more generally, as well, because we are seeing some trends which we do want to bring to the attention, but that piece of work is ongoing at the minute, just to highlight that. I think the other thing we do point out where there are commonalities, and we've mentioned before, you know, mental ill health as a main cause of absence. That is not something that just the NI civil service is grappling with. Other civil services are grappling with that as well, and the private sector are grappling with that. We do also point out that our local councils have levels of absence which are higher than the civil service as well. Again, in the interest of balance, we're trying to be fair and balanced and reasonable in terms of what we report. So it's a difficult area, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, it's a matter we'll continue to ask questions about supporting people back into employment, but it is a concern. People have been carried in long-term absences and how that's skewing figures across the civil service. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. No further members have... Deirdre Hargey, yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry, and I had to pop out there, apologies. It was just interesting just looking at some of the figures, obviously, in terms of just changes, particularly, and then obviously COVID and different societal shocks and stuff that we've all had to manage, but obviously one of the areas was the turnover in permanent secretaries, and then the amount of temporary promotions as well. I think it was sitting around 73% increase since 2020, which kind of highlights a lot of change which is happening in that period. But then also how there was a 19% increase in terms of, where was it? I think it was in higher end staff that was paid, and I know that's been an issue that's been raised in local councils as well. So it's just, what do you see? I know one of the things you're saying, a lot of it's around systems and implementation, but is leadership, or that instability and a consistent leadership within the civil service, is that an issue, or what would you see as the kind of key issues that need to be focused on?
I'll maybe make some comments and then invite others in. We certainly did, we thought it was right to point out the high turnover of permanent secretaries in the last 6 years, because again, to put into context, my starting point for this was looking at previous report on capacity and capability, looking at why the recommendations that had been accepted hadn't been progressed as quickly, and taking into account the shocks that you refer to. It's the leadership that is tasked with taking those recommendations forward. So therefore, pointing out that there has been quite a high turnover has to have its impact too. Now, we make no comment. There are reasons for that: retirement, people leaving. There have also been reshuffles at that permanent secretary level. We have a section where we do talk about the importance of planning ahead, or the importance of succession planning. And as you point out, whilst we note there has been growth in the senior civil service at that over that period as well, it's grown by 19%. We also do note that the median age of that senior civil service has increased. So at the time of the previous report, it was 47, it's up to 53. So that's why succession planning is really important, to keep an element of stability of leadership to drive through this huge transformational change that is needed. So I don't know if any others want to comment and any other things.
I mean, I think those are the key points, you know, that there has been an increase in the senior civil service in terms of numbers. So there's been a 21% movement since our report in 2020. That there has been a high turnover at permanent secretary level in particular, and we have seen some departments with 4 permanent secretaries since we published our report in 2020, which is quite a significant turnover in such a short period of time. And concerns obviously would be around the level of consistency that's provided if there are so many different permanent secretaries over such a short period of time. Other departments have had 3 in that time, and we also have quite a significant number of vacancies at the senior civil service level as well. So all of that, you know, creates issues in terms of delivering consistent leadership.
If I could just add, so the other thing which I was saying in our opening comments, that 7 out of 9 of the departments are identifying people as a key corporate risk. Now, your corporate risk owners and those who are responsible for taking action to address the corporate risk are your senior leaders of those departments, you know, your boards and your senior leaders. So that's why that stability, that collective responsibility to affect the action that's needed to address those corporate risks are so important. So much is vested in those leaders in affecting the change that's needed to address that risk.
Or just one more, in terms of the collective leader, do you think it's still very too siloed in terms of an approach, or that they're working in a siloed way, looking down departments rather than looking across, or has that come up as an issue?
I would certainly still see evidence of that and highlight that in my work. I'm talking more widely than this report, Deirdre. I would still comment on that quite a lot, and that's at all levels. You know, I'm not resting it just at senior levels. We do see departments working in silos in a number of our reports.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that was really helpful. No further members of the wish to ask a question. Oh, Brian, we're going to come back.
Just a brief question. Just in terms of the assessment of the recommendations, when you say about 5.13.5, I think it was, who did the assessment of that? Did the departments do it, or did you do it? And was there any involvement for individual civil servants? Was there did you take any findings or opinions from civil servants directly?
So the way that we approached that was that we asked the Department of Finance for an update on where they felt they were against the recommendations, and that is reflected in Appendix 1 of the report. And then we undertook our own analysis of the information that had been provided to us in response to those recommendations. So it's very much our view and our analysis of the information that was provided. So we did have conversations with DOF officials that we didn't agree on all of the ratings, but it's very much our assessment of the information that they provided to us.
So they're not marking their own homework then? You're marking it? Yes.
Yes, very much so. They provided the information to us and their views about where they were against recommendations, but we undertook our own analysis of that information that they provided to us.
In terms of individual workers, you didn't have an open call as such for this report? No,
we didn't. We looked at the staff surveys that had been undertaken by the civil service and reported some of the findings of those staff surveys, but we didn't do direct engagement with civil servants per se, no.
There was some detail in those staff surveys?
Yeah, and they're publicly available. They are publicly available as well, and they do, in certain areas, get broken down by grade, etc., so you can get a sense of who's responding to them. So I think there were 2 that had taken place throughout the period of our report, and we drew heavily on those where applicable.
Sorry, can I just add, the main consultation we had with civil servants was the head of professions group. So we had a sample number of those, and the concerns they had with their role are included in the report.
Okay. Were they more direct than some of their bosses?
Yeah, they were very direct in terms of what the issues were they were facing in that role.
And but just to expand on that point there, so one of the things obviously that came out of, and still is a persistent theme in your 26 report, and was in the 2020 report, and indeed in the came out of the Cochrane inquiry, is an imbalance or between generalists and specialist services, and presumably the heads of professions groups, some of whom will be generalists, or will be, there'll be a policy development group where there's but are they still, is that a frustration or an observation they would continue to make?
With the head of professions group, they were very much specialists, which is quite a small number in the context of the civil service as a whole. Certainly, is that around 60% of the civil service are generalist posts.
Yeah. Okay. One other question, just to go back to the point you made about productivity and better measuring productivity and having that as part of the workforce strategy, is you also mentioned the ESRI work that had been done. Are we an outlier then in terms of not being able to measure properly, specifically civil service and I guess public sector more generally, productivity? That's a specific problem we have here.
Yeah, that is a there is a survey that is done. I'll come back to you with the detail of it if that's okay, Chair. But I can't remember if it's worldwide or it's European wide, which many jurisdictions feed into, and it allows you to compare productivity. I will source it for you and come back to you on that. And when we were trying to do that piece of work to incorporate it into the report, it was pointed out that Northern Ireland hadn't taken place in the last iteration of that survey, so we are somewhat of an outlier, but I'll get you the detail of that and forward it to you.
It would be helpful to know, because that already is a critical question. There's questions about, obviously, when it comes to sickness absence and performance management, what are the persistent issues that aren't being dealt with either because of management, or are there persistent productivity issues which bluntly aren't being measured, so they're never being addressed, and maybe people aren't keen to talk about it, or there's but I think that would be helpful. Okay, we might just go into, that's been really useful. If members are content, we might just go into closed session for a while, and just because we are effectively in local PAC here, and so we're going to do a PAC do, which is have wee closed sessions where they talk and get themselves briefed without the cameras, which is useful when you're doing a detailed inquiry.
If we go into that.
Yeah.
Okay. You can go ahead, press the. There we go. Back on.
Okay, members, thank you very much. We just we had a brief closed session there with colleagues from NIAO. There are a couple of additional pieces we will ask for in relation to a piece of information that the PAC has seen in terms of a review, but also I think we may get some further historic detail, which we talked about, around the Hawks role and indeed historic links to agreements, and whether we want to explore that. And we may so we'll follow up on both of those things, and that was extremely useful. I don't think we have any further questions we need to address, but and
there's papers, Chair, that CNAG has indicated she'd provide.
There are particular papers you've indicated that will be provided, which I thought I had a note of, but anyway,
I have a note.
You have the clerk has a note. Okay. In that case, thank you all very much. It's extremely useful. So thank you, Dorinnia, Suzanne and Laura. We really appreciate your time and most useful. Thank you very much. We may hear again from you in this course, this inquiry, but that's been really, really useful. And we're basically nicking all your work as the PAC normally does. We're nicking this time it's the Finance Committee nicking your work for our inquiry. Cheers, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So yes, thank you. So yes, indeed, yes. Now, members, we are going to discuss a couple of other additional bits relating to this inquiry. First of all is at page 29 of the table pack, there's correspondence from NISRA in relation to, so they've come back to us. Is that a table pack? No, it's native pack. So that's a new table pack. That is a new table pack. NISRA, it's at page 29, and then there is a process evaluation report on the AO pilot recruitment competition. So I think it's fair to say, so NISRA have given us a very detailed response, some of which is contextual and will be useful. I think the two key points to reflect on are, number one, they I think it's fair to say, aren't thrilled about the way our questionnaire and survey has been put together. They question it in any case. I would say, from our perspective, I'm glad they've given us their view, and I think it's worth us noting that and considering it as we consider our responses to it. It's important to say, I think, in response, that this is always going to be a relatively, because of the resource that an Assembly Committee has, a limited information gathering exercise. We don't and wouldn't be presenting any of the data as a scientifically produced or accredited opinion poll. So I want to assure NIPSA, and indeed anybody who wishes to reply to the survey, of that. It will give us, I think, a useful sense of themes, but obviously we'll be, as we would be with all the information, judicious about how it is presented in the final report, and the main part of the report is really evidence that we gather via written and oral presentations, historic publications including PAC and NIAO reports, other relevant information from other jurisdictions, and we will factor that into our report. So I want to assure people that we aren't planning on publishing a sort of, we're all politicians, we all obsess over polls, we're not planning on publishing a poll that is presented as a scientific, but I think it is important that we, as a committee, offered civil servants the opportunity to give us their feedback, albeit acknowledging we will be careful about how that is presented in our final report, hopefully to address some of those issues. Secondly, they've asked, indeed, yes, and indeed it does talk about the people survey, which is going to be a core evidence source for us, and indeed we talked about it today. It's also worth saying they've asked to give evidence separately. I'm personally content with that. I think that's a reasonable request. That NIPSA is the largest trade union representing civil servants, and will have really important information, and given they've specifically asked for their own evidence session, I think I'm happy to grant that as long as other members are. I'm just going to bring in Deputy Chair first of all, and then Deirdre Hargey.
Yeah, thank you. And I think as a committee, we're right to put out our survey to people directly, to give them the chance, because everyone deserves to have their voice in this, and we have the right to go direct to people. We're not forcing anybody to engage, so anybody that engage wants to, and aren't identifiable, aren't putting it in. And I think it's fair to say in many aspects, especially smaller parts and branches that are slightly detached within the civil service, they often feel that their views aren't broadly represented by the union. It's the very big broad brush thing. So I think that there's a lot of very specific views that need to be heard. So we are hearing from the unions, but I think that I feel very strongly that we should be having the survey to give individuals their voices, because we are a committee here that's representing the people of Northern Ireland, and we're trying to hear directly from all of the civil servants. So, and not everybody's in the union as well. So I am fully supportive of the survey as
I think it's legitimate for us to also just point out and in a sense reassure people in general, people who are responding to it, but also people in NIPSA. We've never presented, nor would we have the resource to present this as an opinion poll, or to scientifically say we have surveyed civil servants and they give this view on binary questions. We will produce a thematic report based on evidence we get. This is one ability, and it will give civil servants the opportunity to give us things, which part of what that may do is generate questions and lines of inquiry for us rather than specific statistical outputs. So I want to reassure people in that regard. But it is fair enough for us to go out, and we are elected representatives who are entitled to go out and ask people. Deirdre Hargey.
No, Mine was just to agree with your suggestion that we invite NIPSA in just for an evidence session. So.
They are coming in. The only thing they had asked for was their own evidence session separate to other, separate to FDA and IC2. I'm content if other members are content with that we do that. That would mean an extra evidence session, maybe one after the other, but actually it won't be one after the other because they can't do the 17th of June, which is when we're getting IC2 in.
We'll find a time. Sure.
Okay, so if we're content with both of those now. The other point relates to the AO pilot, the process evaluation. It's useful that we have this, members. some of this is quite high level. I read through it in a kind of scan way. Some of it in response was quite generic, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it was quite kind of high level. But if members are content, we will kind of add this to our evidence pack for the committee report. Okay?
Great, yeah.
Grand. Okay, right. Now, members, we're going to go on to, yes, I think we've done all that. Okay, now we're going to go on to agenda item 10, which is the Marriage and Civil Partnerships Bill, consideration of committee stage approach. So page 262 of the meeting pack, there's a clerk's memo on the approach for committee stage and the consideration of indicative timetables. We have, I think, somewhere, Aoife Baker, who is, Aoife, apologies if I could hear an Aoife, not an Aoife, apologies, who is going to give us, who's the bill clerk, and is going to give us evidence. So if we're members content, we're going to close session to hear from the bill clerk.
Agreed.
Just press.
We agreed?
Press the button, Steve.